In the 1930s, governments genuinely feared printing money. In 2020, they printed without visible restraint. Both eras, despite their differing tactics, culminated in the same fundamental outcome. Power became more concentrated, trust further eroded, and ordinary citizens ultimately paid the enduring price. Act 13, the hidden lesson. The true, underlying lesson of the Great Depression transcends mere market dynamics. It is fundamentally about the pervasive nature of illusion. Every epoch, without fail, convinces itself that its currency is inviolable, its leaders supremely competent, and its financial system utterly impervious to collapse. Yet, every epoch eventually confronts the same harsh reality. It is not. Money, it turns out, is a potent weapon. Under the gold standard, it rigorously enforced discipline. Under the current fiat money system, it serves to enforce control. Either way, it invariably serves the interests of power. When trust ultimately collapses, that very weapon turns inward, consuming all. Act 14, what it means for you. So, the next time you encounter phrases like interest rates, quantitative easing, or defending the currency, pause and remember this. These are not merely dry technical terms or abstract economic battle plans. In the 1930s, the imperative to defend the currency translated directly into widespread starvation wrought by devastating deflation. Today, the strategy of stimulating the economy often equates to the erosion of your purchasing power through inflation. The approach differs, yet the ultimate outcome for ordinary citizens remains disquietingly similar. Governments survive. Banks adapt. Elites adjust. Ordinary people pay the price. The Great Depression wasn't the end of capitalism. It was its profound transformation, from a system inherently backed by tangible gold to one precariously backed by intangible promises. Act 15, the warning. In 1944, nations convened at Bretton Woods to forge a radically new system. Currencies were pegged directly to the dollar, and the dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold. The United States officially became the world's undisputed banker. The Depression had effectively buried the old empire of British gold and unequivocally crowned a new empire of American credit. Act 11. What most people Mississippi. Most people understandably recall the Great Depression as an unparalleled economic tragedy. Indeed it was, but this narrative often overlooks its equally profound identity as a monumental transfer of power. The gold standard didn't perish because it was an economic failure in isolation. It died precisely because it rigidly restricted political power. Defending gold often meant imposing harsh austerity and facing widespread social unrest. Abandoning it, on the other hand, offered the seductive possibility of inflation and greater governmental control. Either way, ordinary citizens often found themselves losing out. Every so-called rescue, every bailout, every act undertaken in the name of stability invariably pushed power further upward, from individual savers to nation-states, from dynamic markets to entrenched bureaucrats. The Great Depression was not merely a collapse. It was, fundamentally, a takeover, a shift from gold to paper, from individual economic freedom to centralized management. Act 12, the modern echo. Should this historical account feel remote or disconnected from your present reality, I urge you to look closer. In 2008, the world once again confronted a seismic financial crisis. Banks teetered and fell, credit markets seized up, yet this time, central banks responded by conjuring trillions of dollars, pounds, and euros into existence. Instead of allowing the harsh realities of deflation, they consciously opted for inflation. Instead of permitting systemic failures to run their course, they actively propped up the entire system. Economic collapse, as history so often demonstrates, proves fertile ground for extremism. In Germany, a staggering 6 million people found themselves unemployed. The once robust middle class, still reeling from the devastating hyperinflation of a decade prior and now utterly crushed by deflation, desperately turned to a charismatic figure who promised both vengeance and national revival, Adolf Hitler. In Japan, militarists ruthlessly rose to power, propagating the belief that territorial conquest was the only viable path to national survival. In Italy, Benito Mussolini aggressively glorified state control, consolidating his fascist grip. In America, President Roosevelt expanded federal power far more than any predecessor. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin ruthlessly exploited the surrounding global chaos to tighten his iron grip on the populace. Different ideologies, certainly, but all stemmed from the same foundational root cause: monetary failure. The Great Depression wasn't merely an economic collapse. It was a profound, global reshuffling of power. Act 10. The Recovery and the New Order. By the late 1930s, signs of recovery were at last discernible, though this resurgence was far from a natural market correction. Governments worldwide had asserted unprecedented command. In the United States, Roosevelt's ambitious New Deal initiative not only constructed vital infrastructure, created much-needed employment, and rekindled hope, but also fundamentally institutionalized state control over vast swathes of the economy. By 1939, however, the imperative of rearmament for an impending global conflict largely supplanted the focus on economic recovery. When World War II finally concluded, the global monetary map was unrecognizable. Gold had been painstakingly hoarded in Fort Knox, and the mighty dollar now reigned supreme over the world's financial system. Act 7. Roosevelt's Revolution. In 1933, as the nation teetered on the brink, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency. His very first decisive action was not, as many might expect, aimed at job creation, but rather at seizing control of the monetary system itself. He promptly declared a nationwide bank holiday, effectively freezing the entirety of the financial apparatus. Then came Executive Order 6102, a move of stunning audacity: the confiscation of all private gold. Americans were formally ordered to surrender their gold coins and bullion to the government. They were compensated at a rate of $20.67 per ounce. Just months later, the government unilaterally revalued gold to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the dollar was devalued by a massive 40%. This represented the single largest wealth transfer in U.S. history, directly from citizens to the state, carried out under the banner of national recovery. The hidden tax of inflation had decisively returned. Act 8. The Currency Wars. Once America had taken the bold step of devaluing its currency, a domino effect ensued across the globe. The 1930s rapidly descended into a global currency war, with nations frantically competing to cheapen their own money in a desperate bid for economic survival. The dollar fell, then the franc, then the lira, then the yen. Tariffs, in turn, rose sharply, and global trade collapsed dramatically. Economists would later label this competitive devaluation, but in reality, it was undisguised economic warfare. Each country ruthlessly attempted to export its domestic pain abroad. The ultimate result was a fragmented world of rival currency zones: sterling, dollar, yen, and even those still clinging to gold, each fiercely defending its own economic territory. Globalization, a defining trend of the preceding era, dramatically reversed. And the damage inflicted wasn't solely financial. It was profoundly political. Act 9. The Political Fallout. In Germany, widespread misery directly fueled the rise of dangerous political extremism. In America, factories stood shuttered while immense quantities of gold sat uselessly in national vaults. The gold standard was originally conceived to create global order. Instead, it chillingly synchronized chaos. Every nation found itself chained to the same rapidly sinking ship. Act 5. Britain breaks first. The first major power to yield to these immense pressures was Great Britain. By 1931, a relentless outflow of gold from the venerable Bank of England had begun, relentlessly eroding the strength of the pound sterling. The government frantically slashed wages and drastically cut public spending, but nothing seemed to stem the tide. Finally, in September 1931, Britain made the monumental decision to abandon the gold standard altogether. Overnight, the pound instantly plummeted by 30%. The world was utterly shocked. For over a century, the British pound had been considered as good as gold. Suddenly, it was not. Yet, within a mere few months, Britain began to show clear signs of recovery. Exports rose, credit began to loosen, and industrial production ticked steadily upward. The lesson was clear for all to see, but few nations dared to truly learn it. ##### Act 6. America holds on. Across the tempestuous Atlantic, the United States, however, clung to the gold standard with an almost religious fervor. President Herbert Hoover staunchly proclaimed that maintaining sound money was not merely an economic policy, but a profound moral imperative. The result, predictably, was catastrophic. Deflation gripped the nation in an iron vice. Prices fell by a third. Farmers, seeing no value in their produce, were forced to pour milk into ditches. It simply wasn't worth the cost of shipping. Millions found themselves unemployed, and bread lines stretched interminably through every major city. The dollar remained strong, yet its citizens were starving. The newspapers hailed it as undeniable progress, yet prosperity built precariously on debt is not true prosperity. It is, fundamentally, leverage. And leverage, always, eventually snaps. #### Act 3. The money war begins. In the immediate aftermath of the devastating crash, the fledgling Federal Reserve confronted a pivotal dilemma. Should it inundate the financial system with liquidity, or should it instead constrict credit, prioritizing the defense of the dollar's value? The choice, ultimately, was for strict discipline. In a world still rigidly tied to the gold standard, every single dollar in circulation was ostensibly backed by a corresponding amount of gold. The Fed harbored deep fears that if it printed too much currency, foreign nations would inevitably lose faith and demand immediate redemption of their dollar holdings in gold. So, instead of easing monetary conditions, it dramatically raised interest rates. Liquidity swiftly vanished from the system. Banks began to collapse with alarming regularity. Between 1930 and 1933, a staggering nearly 10,000 American banks failed. People queued outside, desperate to withdraw their life savings, only to discover the vaults utterly empty. This was no longer just a market crash. It had spiraled into a full-blown monetary collapse, and it was happening everywhere. ### Act 4. The Gold Trap. The gold standard, once revered as the bedrock of global financial stability and a point of civilizational pride, had, by this point, tightened into a suffocating noose. Under its rigid rules, national currencies were immutably fixed to the value of gold. If gold left your country, you were compelled to raise interest rates, slash government spending, and drastically reduce wages in a painful effort to entice it back. This economic strategy was known as deflation, and it was, in essence, economic suicide. In Britain, unemployment soared past 20%. Yet, the crash itself, devastating as it was not the ultimate cause of the Great Depression. It was merely the incendiary spark. The inferno that subsequently raged was fueled by misguided policy, by decisions meticulously crafted in the name of stability, which paradoxically ended up obliterating trust across the entire world. But before the devastating collapse truly took hold, there was the illusion, the dazzling mirage of endless prosperity that convinced an entire generation they were utterly untouchable. ### Act 2. The Illusion of Prosperity. The 1920s roared into existence as a decade defined by its vibrant noise, the infectious rhythms of jazz, the burgeoning industry of automobiles, the ambitious ascent of new skyscrapers, and an almost boundless optimism. America had emerged from the crucible of World War I not only victorious, but also supremely confident, its economic might undeniable. Europe, by contrast, was broken, its gold reserves drained, its debts mounting inexorably. The United States consequently assumed the role of the world's banker, its primary factory, and its last great hope. Wall Street, in this new global order, transformed into the planet's undisputed financial capital. Newspapers of the era christened it the Roaring Twenties. But beneath the seductive rhythm of jazz and the effervescent sparkle of champagne, a profoundly dangerous illusion was steadily taking shape. Credit was astonishingly cheap, speculation was rampant and unchecked, and the Federal Reserve, then barely 10 years old, was actively fueling it all. Banks enthusiastically encouraged ordinary people to buy stocks on margin. For every single dollar you personally owned, you could borrow an astonishing 9 more. Clerks, farmers, and factory workers alike all genuinely believed they could effortlessly become millionaires through the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average soared to unprecedented heights. One fateful morning in 1929, the world's richest nation found itself abruptly bankrupt. Crucially, this unprecedented collapse wasn't triggered by war, widespread famine, or military invasion, but rather by the stark reality of financial figures on a screen that suddenly ceased to make sense. What then unfolded was far more than a mere market crash. It devolved into a global financial war. This was a ferocious battle waged over gold, debt, and fundamental survival, a conflict that fundamentally rewired the entire modern world. This, truly, is the historical narrative you likely never encountered in school. For the Great Depression wasn't simply a market failure. It was a profound struggle for command over the very essence of money itself. It was a war fought not with conventional weaponry or battalions of soldiers, but with the subtle yet devastating instruments of interest rates, national currencies, and the power of the printing press. And, like every war, it produced clear winners and losers, not by accident, but through deliberate design. Act 1. The crack. By late 1929, insidious, small fractures had already begun to surface within the global economy. Industrial production showed signs of slowing. Farm prices were precipitously falling, and the nations of Europe exhibited unmistakable signs of severe economic strain. Yet, a pervasive and blinding optimism gripped everyone. The market, it was widely believed, simply had to continue its ascent. It always did. Then came Black Thursday, October 24, 1929. The initial sell orders began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Within a matter of hours, however, unchecked panic and chaos violently engulfed Wall Street. By Tuesday, October 29th, now infamously known as Black Tuesday, billions in accumulated wealth had simply vanished into thin air. Men stood outside the New York Stock Exchange, utterly silent, their gazes fixed and vacant, collectively unable to process the enormity of what had just transpired. History, as is often observed, rarely repeats itself precisely, but its echoes are undeniably potent. When national and global debt scales dizzying new heights, when rampant speculation metastasizes across markets, and when central banks find themselves in the contradictory roles of both economic arsonists and emergency firefighters, the familiar, ominous pattern inevitably reemerges. The 1970s, 2008, 2020, different decades, yet the same unsettling rhythm. Each instance sees money weaponized, and with each instance, the fragile fabric of trust is further rent asunder. The Great Depression wasn't just an isolated event. It was, in retrospect, a chilling manual. And we, it seems, are still following its instructions. So, the next time you hear about a market crash, resist the urge to merely think of abstract numbers or intricate graphs. Instead, contemplate the deeper, unseen war. The one fought in the secure vaults of central banks, in the labyrinthine corridors of government debt offices, and in the quiet, unassuming rooms where the very nature of money is subtly remade. For the real battles of our age are no longer fought with bullets and bombs. They are, instead, waged with interest rates, national currencies, and the relentless hum of printing presses. The Great Depression was the inaugural global financial war. Every subsequent crisis has been another campaign in that same, ongoing conflict. The ceaseless war over trust, over control, and over the fundamental value of everything you possess. If this perspective has offered you a fresh insight, then consider subscribing. The answers, after all, are not hidden somewhere in the distant future.